Aloha attendees, thank you for coming. And my name is Roger Joellyn. I'm the Executive Director of the Hawaii Book and Music Festival. And it's my pleasure to have this panel today, which I think you'll find absolutely fascinating. If you have questions, please put them in the Q&A at the bottom of your screen, or I think on iPads it's at the top somewhere. I want to let you know that if your Ohana and network and friends have missed this and would like to have seen it, it will be available on YouTube on the Better Tomorrow Speaker Series YouTube channel. And it's also being live streamed on Facebook. And it will be later edited into highlight video, which will be up on our website and also on the Better Tomorrow Speaker Series channel. So it'll be there for almost probably at least a year. So there are plenty of opportunities to check it out again. So without further ado, I'm going to turn this over to Cristina and Jennifer. Aloha.
Aloha, everyone. Thank you, Roger, so much for featuring our book in the Hawaii Book and Music Festival. Jennifer and I and three of our contributors are really happy to be here with you today. Thank you for all of you attending. My name is Cristina Bacchilega. I'm a Professor Emerita of English at the University of Hawaii at Manoa, where I taught from 1983 to 2020. And I taught fairy tales and their adaptations, folklore and literature, and cultural studies. And I am the co-editor of Inviting Interruptions, Wonder Tales in the 21st Century with Jennifer Orme. Jennifer.
Thank you, Cristina, and thank you, Roger, for having us. I am Jennifer Orme, and I'm in Toronto, Canada right now, but I'm very happy to be able to come back to Honolulu for the Book and Music Festival, even if it's just virtually for now. I did my PhD at the University of Hawaii, Manoa with Cristina, and I'm now an independent scholar and writer, and I teach also virtually for the University of Winnipeg in Manitoba, Canada right now. So thank you all again for joining us today, and special thanks to our wonderful contributors, Nisi Shawl, Veronica Schanoes, and Joellyn Rock, all of whom you will hear from presently. So Cristina and I are, as we say, the editors of Inviting Interruptions, Wonder Tales in the 21st Century, and it's a book we had a lot of fun working on. Cristina, shall I start talking a little bit about our title, or did you want to jump in?
Well, I just wanted to maybe say something about the impetus for the collection, at least in my from my perspective, if that's okay.
Yeah,
Jennifer?
of course.
All right. Well, you know, we're in 2021, and I still remember reading Angela Carter's The Bloody Chamber and Jack Sykes's anthology, Don't Bet on the Prince, in the early 1980s, right? And the reason I remember that experience is that those collections were transformative for me. And I believe, as a scholar and as a reader of fairy tales, that the genre itself is transformative and also always transforming. So I really wanted to do something in the early 20th century that would showcase the ways in which wonder tales have transformed since the 1980s and how they are transformative today and for whom. So that was my impulse in kind of thinking the collection up, and I really wanted to work with Jennifer to do this. So do you want to talk a little bit about stuff Jennifer?
Yes, I like talking about stuff, and I love working with you, Cristina. And one of the things that I think is particularly fun about the text is our title, Inviting Interruptions, Wonder Tales in the 21st Century. And it's a collection of short stories and visual images, as well as visual verbal texts that all relate to fairy tales and wonder in different ways. So that's what our book is about. But the title is kind of funny. We're kind of proud of it because it's playful and has multiple, even contradictory sort of meanings. Because invitations are like requests for attention, right? They can be seductive, they can be polite. They ask you to come along and join us. Interruptions, on the other hand, we see very differently usually. They're kind of rude. It's a demand for something or a demand to something to stop. It's almost the opposite of an invitation. But when you put them together, an invitation to interrupt is asking for something to stop the smooth flow of the expected, we think. And then that interruption can be a kind of invitation of itself, an invitation to shift perspective and to see a tale or the genre from a different space. And that's what most of our artists and writers do. And I think that we'll find that when we talk a little bit more today. So as editors, that's what we were looking for in the text that we chose. We're inviting you, the readers, to look for and revel in the kinds of interruptions the works in the book enact. So that's a little bit about our title. But maybe, Cristina, you want to jump on to some other ideas that we wanted to talk about today?
Just that, often fairy tales and wonder tales are associated with matters of gender, issues of gender, and that our collection, of course, does address gender, but also many other issues and takes a kind of intersectional perspective. That's a very important way in which we're interrupting, I think, some of the received ideas about wonder tales and fairy tales. I think, one of the wonderful things about getting a book published is that there are blurbs then on the back. And I was particularly taken with the blurb by Marina Warner, which is actually not in the back, but inside the book. And and she calls this collection a passionate manifesto for 21st century wonder tales that aren't scared off by polemical themes and take us down bold and unexpected paths. That's exactly like what I was hoping for as a reaction. And, and I think that's part of what engages not only the readers, but the contributors. Like we got wonderful reactions from contributors to the project who really wanted to be part of it and were very generous with their work. Can you talk maybe, Jennifer, a little bit about the different kinds of works we have featured in the book?
Absolutely.
And maybe what I'll do, I'll share my screen and it will be awkward just for a minute.
Okay, I'll just babble a little bit until you get it up there. Talking a little bit more about sort of intersectionality, the idea that we have multiple aspects of all of our identities. And while we think that the stories and images in our book are for everyone, we also recognize in the book that everyone is not like everyone else. Right? We all come from different starting points and we all have multiple different identities and pressures on our lives and places in the world. So bringing some of them together and inviting interruptions, we were hoping that they will all speak to each other, as Cristina was saying, sort of speak to each other intertextually and in surprising and revealing ways. One of the things that's surprising about our book, we think, is this idea of bringing in visual art rather than just, I say, having stories. Like Lewis Carroll's Alice, I've always wondered, what is the use of books without any pictures or conversations? And for as long as I can remember, I was determined that my first book would have pictures in it, preferably color pictures. Now, Cristina, of course, has already written a number of really important books in fairy tale studies and has included images in those. So I knew that she would be keen on including visual art. And luckily, the press didn't think it was a mad idea either. So we got to have our color images throughout the text, which is unusual for this kind of anthology. Now, each image is a standalone text in and of itself. Rather than necessarily illustrating a story, which is what we're used to, illustration's been really important to the fairy tale literary tradition, but we wanted to cast a wider net and include multiple forms. So we have, for example, photography, such as this image from Miwa Yanagi. We have sculpture, figurines, and paintings by the likes of Sherry Boyle. We have mixed media by Nello Hopkinson, and another from Dan Talapapa McMullen, a Samoan-American artist who's often in Hawaii as well. We also wanted to include visual verbal text like Joellyn's that she's going to talk about today, as well as Maya Kern's comics. So we have a whole comic book in there as well. And we even experimented a little by including a film in a book. That is, we provided a link to a short film by David Kaplan, Little Red Riding Hood. So in addition to a lot of different kinds of art and stories, we also have a wide range of creators, from newly emerging artists like former UHM student Anna Kamaya, and even our cover artist, Rosalind Hyatt Orme. We also have very well-established and award-winning artists like Sean Tam, whose image this is. Ultimately, we chose images and stories that we thought were worth conversing about, and our notes in the books sort of start those conversations off with our musings and questions about wonder.
Wonder, yes. So that, we've talked a little bit about the different media that we wanted to include and the intersectionality of these texts. But wonder is something else that we want to celebrate in this collection. So why didn't we call this fairy tales in the 21st century? Because fairy tales immediately in our society, in our culture, evoke magic and Disneyfied magic, okay? While we are thinking more about wonder tales, it's a more inclusive kind of genre, and maybe we'll talk more about that later. But it's also a heuristic for being in the world. It's a mix of curiosity, engagement, awe, connection, humility, and wonder tales across culture mobilize these emotions and ways of relating to the world in transformative ways, because they interrupt things as they are, as we are commonly made to perceive the genre, ourselves, and the world. So that's why wonder, because in wonder, we are kind of thinking or being otherwise. And that's how all the texts in our collection spoke to us. So I think, like, we've talked a lot, Jennifer, or I have at least, and it's time to hear from our contributors. And we have, and I'll be muting myself while others are speaking from now on. We have our first contributor is award-winning author, editor, and journalist Nisi Shawl. And she's really a bright star in American science fiction and fantasy writing. She's an advocate for fantastic fiction that reflects actual diversity in the world. We're very excited that she's here with us today. And she contributed the story Lupine to our collection. So take it, Nisi.
All right, thank you. Thank you for that warm introduction. A while back, as I was starting to go public with my readings, I made a vow to always sing at the same time. So then I had to figure out what to sing with each piece. Lupine is a story about youth and age. And so I wanted to sing a song from my childhood called Mary Mac. I really should have someone else here singing it with me, because it's the kind of thing where you do like hand motions and you have, it's a clapping game, and but I'll just do it by myself, and you can imagine we're clapping hands together. Oh, Mary Mac, 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 all dressed in black, 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 with silver buttons, buttons, buttons all down her back, back, back. She asked her mother, mother, mother for 15 cents, cents, cents to see the elephant jump over the fence, fence, fence. He jumped so high, high, high. He touched the sky, 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 and he never came back, back, back till the 4th of July, lie, 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 lie. That's how we did it in my neighborhood. So the story, I'll just read a few minutes from it. Once there was a little girl whose mother hated her. The mother was not a bad woman, but she had not wanted a child. And so she put her daughter into a secret prison and pretended the daughter did not exist. The father was deceived, for he and the woman parted long before he would have learned she was to have a child. Soon after they separated, the mother's love for him languished and died. As for her daughter, the mother felt nothing toward her but the deepest loathing. The little girl, on the contrary, loved her mother very much because she was born to love, and in her prison, she knew no one else. Lupine, as she was called, had not even a kitten or a cricket to love, not even a doll to play with. The wind from the mountains blew seeds into her lonely tower, and she nourished these into plants, flowers, and downy herbs. When her mother brought food and water, Lupine always lavished kisses on her. However, these only strengthened the woman's hatred of her beautiful child. She is young and has her whole life ahead of her. My life is passing by, faster and faster, and soon I will be dead, the mother thought. To fill Lupine's years with misery was the object of her private studies. And one day, she found an answer that would serve. She gave it to Lupine as medicine, but it was really a potion containing an evil spell. Lupine suspected nothing, but complained bitterly of its awful taste. Then she coughed, her eyes rolled back into her head, and she fell to the floor as if dead. The mother laughed with delight and eagerly awaited Lupine's return to wakefulness. When the daughter's eyes opened, she no longer wore her usual sweet smile. Instead, her face was ugly with disdain. The purpose of the potion's spell was to make her act hatefully toward those she loved and lovingly toward those she hated. Lupine reached up to throttle her mother's neck. The woman easily eluded her and ran gleefully down the prison stairs and out of the waste with which it was surrounded. She led Lupine into the thick of civilization where her daughter would suffer the most. I think I'll stop there.
Wow, thank you, Nisi. That's quite a place to stop. And I'm just kind of like, oh, isn't she going to keep going? But I understand. And I think you've really whetted our appetites for more. Next, we're going to be going on to Veronica Schanoes, who is a fiction writer and scholar. She lives in New York City, teaches at Queens College, CUNY, and has just published an amazing book of short stories entitled Burning Girls and Other Stories. So look out for that. Her wonder tale in Inviting Interruptions is titled Among the Thorns, And you'll be talking to us a little bit about that, right, Veronica?
Sorry. Yes, I will talk about that. Sorry.
Thank you.
I got very caught up in Nisi's story, and my mind was on that. So the story, I'm going to talk a little bit about my story rather than read from it. It's rather unusual for me in that it was a story that I wrote in answer to a fairy tale, not because I loved the fairy tale, but because I was very upset about the existence of the fairy tale. It's a fairy tale from the Grimm's collection that's rarely reprinted now, called The Jew in the Thorn Bush, or The Jew Among the Thorns, or The Jew in the Brambles. It depends on the translation. And the long and the short of the story is that a young, virtuous German peasant is granted 3 wishes from a dwarf by the side of the road who he's been kind to. He's given his last penny to. And he wishes for a blowpipe that will hit anything he aims at, a fiddle that will make anyone who hears it dance, and the power that nobody can refuse a request of his. And then he makes use of these gifts to torture a Jewish man he meets by the side of the road, and eventually at the next town get him hanged. And that's the happy ending. So that's the end of the story. Everybody else presumably lives happily ever after. And there we are. And while it was never, on the level of Cinderella, it was not an unpopular story. Arthur Rackham illustrated it. It was one of the 25 stories that Edgar Taylor first translated from the Grimms in 1823, I want to say, if I'm getting that year right. So it was certainly, popular enough. And its existence made me angry. Speaking as somebody who has always loved fairy tales and grew up reading fairy tales and also is Jewish. It was a sort of a bit of cold water in the face about who the European fairy tale tradition belongs to, and who belongs to it, and who gets to make use of it. And I will firmly say that it belongs to me. I grew up with those stories, but it was certainly, with this story, it became apparent to me that it was not original. It was not, it did not envision me as one of its own. So I wrote this story, and it's about the Jewish man's daughter. He's a peddler, a traveling peddler, which was a fairly common occupation for Jews in 17th century Hesse, which is where I set it. And with the help of a sort of neglected Hebrew mother goddess, she returns to the town 10 years later and takes revenge on the German peasant and the rest of the town. It's very much a revenge story. And then at the end, she takes a baby she's been nannying, more or less, and leaves, which is a decision that I'm still, it opens with stories, Gentile stories of Jews stealing or purchasing or otherwise obtaining Gentile babies. At the same time, when writing the story, I could not in good conscience leave the baby in the town, given what happens to the town. So it's a decision I sit with, that creative decision. And I still go back and forth about this story because I know from my research, from my work, from my theorizing, from talking to other writers, that rewriting a story extends its life. It doesn't erase it. It doesn't efface it, right? You don't stop reading Bluebeard because you've read The Bloody Chamber. In fact, The Bloody Chamber really only reaches its full meaning if you have read Bluebeard. And so this story, which is no longer being published, what was I doing revivifying it in this way? On the other hand, the other question I was asking myself is, whom does it benefit to sanitize the European fairy tale tradition? Does it benefit me? I suppose so, since I grew up with it. But at the same time, it's also it's a whitewash, right? It's also an exoneration of a tradition that perhaps does not deserve an exoneration, that perhaps we should be able to understand it as bearing the marks of the better and the worse of European tradition and culture. And so that is the story I wrote. That's the story that I'm honored to have included in this volume. And I have lots to say about the different decisions I made writing it, but that may be getting too detailed. So I will wait until until they come up organically.
Thank you, Veronica, because you also really brought out the complexity of these traditions, these narrative traditions, and we're really speaking to how, you know, we say that the fairy tale has universal appeal, but what does that really mean when we, as individuals in different cultures and different times, are reading or exposed to these stories? And kind of the assumption is that we will enjoy them, but we don't always, right? So thank you. The next contributor is Joellyn Rock. And her presentation or her creative work includes digital print, interactive narrative, and experimental video. Joellyn Rock teaches at the University of Minnesota Duluth, and we were very pleased to include her multimedia piece, Bare Bones, in the collection. I also want you to know that just recently she illustrated one of Jack Sipes's fairy tale adaptations, Titsu, the Boy with the Green Thumbs of Peace. So I know you want to you're going to be sharing your screen, I believe, Joellyn.
To unmute. Yeah, so I will be sharing my desktop first. And can you see my screen? Oh, wait, I'm going to stop my share and do this again because I need to share my audio. Okay. Okay, can you see that? I hope. I'm assuming everyone can see it, otherwise somebody break in and tell me you can't. I wanted to talk a little bit about how I came to work with this particular fairy tale. So I'm going to scrub through some images and then I'm going to play a little bit of a video recording of my section in Inviting Interruptions. And I wanted to just let you know that I think people have already said some really interesting things, and some that I would like to build on is just, you know, how do these old stories cross our paths and why do we choose to work with them? And I would just say that for me, the story, it's a Russian tale of Vasilisa and Baba Yaga. And I will say that I am mispronouncing the name of Baba Yaga. A Russian speaker would say Baba Yaga, I believe, but never criticize someone for mispronouncing a word because that means that they encountered it when they were reading. And since this is a book festival, we can celebrate even the mispronunciation of words. This fairy tale was not known to me. I grew up on German fairy tales, European fairy tales, but I'd never encountered Baba Yaga, the witch that really is the most powerful one of Slavic and Russian tales. And in this story of Vasilisa, I was just really drawn to it because it was new and scary and weird to me. And there were some surreal qualities to it that I was really drawn to and I wanted to work with. I wanted to rewrite the story and I wanted to re-image it. I wanted to think about building a bridge between traditional oral tradition into storybooks, into digital media. And I think that for me, fairy tales are a really wonderful way, and we can call them wonder tales or fairy tales, but they provide for me, as someone who works in digital media, a lovely bridge between old traditional storytelling methods and new ones, because they anchor us. You know, there's a way that they anchor us in this old familiar thing and then take us into this new territory. So I am showing you an image of Vasilisa, and then I'm going to scrub through. During the course of making this project, I made a lot of different images, and I collaged them into many other images. So the story can be told in these complex images. I will just talk you through them really quickly. This is Vasilisa grieving at the beginning of the story when her mother dies, and all she has left is a little doll of her mother's. She's under the wing of stepmother and stepsisters who don't really like her, and they send her off into the woods. They sort of torture her in various ways and then send her off into the woods on an impossible task to get the fire from Baba Yaga, the witch that lives in the woods. And she navigates through her trials and tribulations with the help of this little doll that was given to her by her mother before her mother died. And then she encounters Baba Yaga living in the woods in her hut that walks around on chicken legs. And she, of course, has to do a bunch of tasks for Baba Yaga. She has to serve her food and do housework for her. She has to sort and separate poppy seeds from dirt. And I was at the time getting a MFA in graphic design. And so for me, this fairy tale was a wonderful metaphor for all of the long, tedious tasks of working as a typographer or a designer, sort up late all night, trying to fuss over graphic design elements. And then she inquires of Baba Yaga, can I have the fire to bring back to my family? And here we have a moment of inviting interruptions. We have a moment of asking and questioning the female authority figure and trying to get some answers and trying to get some help. And so I think in many ways, this fairy tale embodies that notion of interrupting. And yes, in the end, Baba Yaga does give Vasilisa the fire that she brings back. She gets it in a stick, in a skull that she carries in a stick back through the woods. She navigates all the way back home again with this flaming skull. And it's a bit of a story of revenge too. So I think we have some overlap in that last story where she brings that flaming skull home, and it does some damage to the evil step family. But most of all, I wanted to point out this notion that I really love about fairy tales, which is that they are multivalent. They are these things that get passed through many, many ways: oral tradition, books, movies, animations, and that they are multivalent because we can stick onto them whatever we want to. You know, we can take on a story and we can make it our own. And so there's this way in which stories keep recycling. I consider myself a remix artist. So for me, it's all about taking things and remixing them and remediating them for other formats. So one of the things I was doing with this remixing was I was like exploring all these typography, letter forms, illuminated letters, patterns, old Russian patterns, new digital patterns. And I ended up building this website. So it's an interactive version of the story. And I'm just going to play this a smidge while I'm talking you through this a little bit. So this is an interactive website that I built 20 years ago. And it was built in the older version of the web, in which you could not put movies or a lot of high resolution images. And so it has that hypertext where you can click on something in the website and it pulls up another piece of information. And you kind of navigate through this in a partially hypertext way, partially scrolling. And the center images kind of change as you click on things. And along the top, you navigate through the parts of the story. And then going down the side, if you're interested, you can also navigate through an intellectual thesis that can be woven back and forth through the themes of the story. So I was lucky enough to work with Jack Sipes for part of this. He was a professor at the University of Minnesota Twin Cities campus at the time, and he took me on as an individual contract. And now I'm going to play this little part of part 4 of the story in bare bones, and it is when Vasilisa encounters Baba Yaga. Hopefully it's loud enough for you when you hear it. Even though there was fresh snow on the ground, there were still Halloween decorations up around the joint. Paper skeletons swung from each porch post. Along the fence, plastic lights, little skulls, rattled and chattered clickety-clack against the railing. The hut had long, jagged icicles, crystal bones, Yaga teeth hanging from its rafters. It grinned ferociously at anyone who dared approach. Weirdest of all, the dwelling suddenly stood up and whirled like a dervish on chicken's feet. It gave her the heebie-jeebies. No basement? A mobile home? Perhaps. Vasilisa heard a whir and looked up into the night sky. There, flying. There she saw it, the silhouette of Baba Yaga descending in her mortar with a pestle, in her black cauldron, her creepy Cuisinart coming in for a landing. With greasy hair streaming behind her, the hag trailed a broom like a giant eraser for deleting her own tracks. She screeched into her parking place and dismounted with a slam. She was in no mood for distractions. Baba Yaga just stood there, with her hands on her hips in the strange glow of the skulls, and Vasilisa took in this shocking composite, this awful specter of a woman, part grandmother, part beast. Baba Yaga was a bony thing. Her look, like the witch in your own worst horror movie. That nose, you know, that chin you're imagining, those teeth like pinking shears, and that wart that belongs in a museum. Her breasts sagged like water balloons, to her knees no doubt, and those legs, one all bone with spidery veins, and the other lumpy and brown, made out of excrement. Excrement? That's what it says. Baba Yaga stopped and sniffed at the air. She clapped her hands, muttered some code, some password under her breath, and the hut rotated upon command, opening its entrance automatically, like a garage door. What do you want? Okay. Is that okay? Could you hear that? Okay.
That was awesome. Thank you so much, all three of you, Nisi and Veronica and Joellyn. I think this gives everyone a taste of what we have in the book and how we connect to other media also. and ways to experience wonder tales and fairy tales. I am hoping for questions from those of who are attending our session, but maybe we'll just start with a question for our contributors. That's okay. So what is the appeal for you as creators, as artists, as writers of wonder tales?
Oh,
Why wonder tales?
I say because the world is full of wonder, and because the term wonder tales, as you say, it's very inclusive. It takes in the whole world. So for me, it's how I approach where I'm living, all this we're living in, and it's what I want to share with people. So yeah, that's the appeal. I get to immerse myself in the wonder, and I get to spread it around. Everybody else is muted.
Veronica, are you going? Oh, I think I said a little bit about this, that for me, they're really an anchor, that they're such an old, I think of them almost like a comfort object that I can go into new territory with, and so I feel like wonder tales are, help me through transitions. When I've gone through the worst shit in my life, I've turned to fairy tales and wonder tales because they sort of ask some big questions. They take you through trials and tribulations. and I've found them instructive for my own sort of growth, but also they help me to, they give me a focus for when I want to do a complex creative project, I guess.
Yeah, I agree with both of those approaches. I'm sorry, it's a little late where I am, and I'm having trouble articulating as well as I should. I keep returning to wonder tales, usually to the European fairy tale tradition in my work, but not only to the European fairy tale tradition, in part because I find there to be a really interesting tension between what comes next in the plot and how I'm going to translate that into the context of my story. So I like working with that element of the plot sketched out for me, and seeing what I can do with it when it's already there. But wonder tales, as Nisi said, they evoke a kind of wonder. Wonder to me has an element of awe in it, a more active kind of awe where you're not silenced, you are still responding, because wonder is also wondering, right? So it's also got the element of curiosity in it, which is why I come to wonder tales for my plots and my interests, and why I find that they speak to me more than other kinds of traditional stories, more than, for instance, classical myth.
And just to kind of add a little bit to this, I mean, we over time, the two terms, wonder tales and fairy tales or tales of magic, 3 terms, have been interchangeable, at least in some scholarship, and especially European scholarship. In the way we're using wonder tale is not like strictly interchangeable with fairy tale, because we're really thinking about the fairy tales that help us recognize and interact with that sense of wonder that includes awe, that includes curiosity, as Veronica was saying. So they're not necessarily the tales that have, you know, the happily ever after ending. They may be tales where, you know, the protagonist's gift is to be able to understand the speech of animals, okay, or is able to connect, as with the Vasilisa story, with a figure that in other kinds of traditions would be interpreted only as monstrous or as villainous, right? So that's where we're going, I think. And when it's not just me and Veronica and the contributors, but I think there's a whole kind of blossoming really of this tradition and recovery of wonder and wonder tales in the fantastic more generally.
Can I add to that as well? For me, one of the important differences between the term fairy tales and the term wonder tales is that fairy tales are specifically a European tradition that occupy a very particular place in a particular function in various cultures they were part of, that, you know, we're not believed, we're used for various purposes. And that while, as I understand it, all human cultures have created tales that evoke wonder and awe, and involve more than what we would consider natural events, they don't necessarily serve the same functions in every culture as the European fairy tale tradition has served in its culture. And so I feel like wonder tales also is more all-inclusive in terms of the stories we draw from.
Absolutely, I agree with that, like 111%. And I also I think I could have said much of what you said if I had been a little more articulate myself about the idea of taking these armatures of wonder from someone else and then building our own sculptures upon them. So good. Yeah, we're doing the same kind of stuff.
And within the collection, you know, we have an example, at least of, or a couple of examples of tales from different traditions that are wonder tales, and in particular, Brian Kamali Kuwata's of No Real Account, which is a kind of adaptation of Mo'olelo, and reaching out to today's young Hawaiians, thinking about what it is to be a hero, right? So yeah, I see there are a couple of comments.
I think there was
it's just like great, and there's a question
for Veronica.
Yeah, there's a question, Veronica.
I see.
Curious to know if you're familiar, Veronica, with Dürrenmatt's play The Visit.
I am not, actually. I am not. It sounds fascinating from what you say. And it's certainly something I thought about, exactly how my protagonist would enact her revenge, right? How she would be able to do this. And eventually she does, she does execute 3 of the main villains in her father's fate. She does eventually seal off the entire town, because one of the things that was really important to me in writing this story was that there was the town had collaborated, right? And it was very much the execution of the Jew and the thorn bush is very much a public lynching. It's the entire town turns out to see him hanged. There's a judge involved, and in my story, I have the town sort of integrate that event into its narrative of itself. So in the end, there was a way in which the town was implicated, and it wasn't just the evil could not be put off on one man who had unfortunate magic gifts. It was a group effort, and so the town does not wind up destroyed, but on the other hand, isn't out there anymore either.
Thanks. Yeah, it's fascinating the way that all of these three pieces that we've talked about today have had to do with justice and different kinds of justice. And I think, Veronica, you really, among the thorns, it's a much more complex kind of idea about, it's not a straightforward kind of revenge. It's something even you as the writer are still processing and thinking about as you were telling us. But the idea of justice, and when we think about fairy tale justice, I think is one thing. And then we think about justice and wonder, or justice and wonder genres, and the use of wonder, that awe, that imagination, and the curiosity that those things can bring up together are, I don't know, how do we work with that? If we think of fairy tale justice as often retributive justice, how might we, or do we, and I don't know, Nisi, Joellyn, if you have ideas about this, and maybe Nisi, in your tale, Lupine, there's a kind of justice that comes through the fairy tale form.
Well, yeah, it does. It comes, Lupine gets her just reward, but in a way, so does her mother. Mm-hmm. Because her mother is like constantly anxious that she is going to die. And so then when that prediction is fulfilled, no more anxiety. So that's how I think of the justice in that, is that everyone gets what they are waiting for.
So what they're waiting for, I think that's really interesting in the idea, do we bring our own justice to, do we cause our own justice to find us? Yeah.
That's what I would think, but mm-hmm. I'm just one person.
One of my favorite mystery novels has the detective say at one point to a person he's talking to, that's the problem with justice. There's no such thing. And to me, that can be where justice and wonder intersect. That there is no way, for the most part, to repair great harms done. There's no way to undo them. There's simply a matter of having to carry on with them having been committed. And so rarely are people who commit cruel and unjust acts and systems that enable cruel and unjust acts held accountable or transformed in a meaningful way. That, to me, that's part of the fantasy of fairy tales, that eventually, if, as Terry Windling put it, if you are kind and brave and lucky, the hero or heroine will make it through, and the wicked one will dance to her death in red hot iron shoes. That so rarely happens in real life,
unless they want the red hot shoes.
yes.
Joellyn, did you want to respond to that question about
I think those were really interesting thoughts. I know that when I was working with my story, the Vasilisa one, that there are, you encounter different versions, right? You encounter different endings. And I wasn't really comfortable with the ending in which Vasilisa brings that skull back in. She puts the skull in the house with her step family, and it burns them to cinders. Like, like, that's where I think the cinder really is in Cinderella. So
Comfortable with that ending.
So I sort of sidestep that in my ending. Like, she puts it down, leaves it there. And then in my version, I just start going through some loops of different versions of the story. Once there was not. Oh, all these versions. Because, I mean, to me, that's kind of that's where the justice is, I guess, is that these stories cross our paths and we get to do with them what we want. We get to reshape them and draw attention to the injustices in the ways that are right for our times, So they plop down and we transform them into things that make sense in our time, I guess.
By telling these stories, we create,
I think,
a place of justice, maybe.
Mm-hmm. I think there's also a lot to be said about who in our culture gets to have revenge fantasies and who doesn't. And I'm thinking of in Disney's Cinderella, there's a scene where Cinderella, she's just perfect in every way. And she comes across her dog who's having a good dream, and he wakes up and she says, "Were you chasing Lucifer, her stepmother's vile cat?" And the dog says, "Yes." And she says, "Did you catch him this time?" The dog says, "Yes." And she says, "That's bad. Don't do that." Right? You're not even allowed to dream about taking revenge on the people who persecute you to be good in certain themes. And yet, we see in our movies, right? How many movies are based on white men shooting their way through dozens and dozens of evildoers because they've done something bad to his woman? And yet, if marginalized people or wronged people don't protest in exactly the right, nonviolent, unobtrusive, convenient way, they're dismissed. And so I think that there's a lot to be said for the violent retribution and revenge that you often get in fairy tales, because there's a lot to be said for who's allowed to even dream about that and who's not.
wow, yes. We have, I think, just a few minutes, and we have a question in the chat for everyone. It's still early, but do we see ways that Wonder Tales are responding to the global COVID-19 pandemic? I've read a few things about a turn in popular culture from the post-apocalyptic towards kindness, collaboration, different kinds of courage, not based on individualism. So just wondering, pun intended, about what you might see emerging from this collective experience that is not experienced in the same way everywhere. Of course, that's really important and part of what we've been talking about. Does anybody want to respond to that? That's a very big question. I mean, I've been thinking about how even with our title, Inviting Interruption, that title has assumed different meanings and valences in these pandemic times. But
well,
are there, yeah.
I'll just take a stab. Well, one thing I think we found out from the pandemic is that the world can change in a second, right?
Yes.
And that is why, I mean, I'm in the state of George Floyd's murder. And that is why it was so powerful when that moment happened and we saw the world rising up and significant changes, things that we could never even consider discussing before, like defunding the police or whatever. So I think that the pandemic has flipped some things in our brains about fantasy becoming reality, about the unthinkable happening. I also will just personally say that I think fairy tales might travel in a similar way to viruses because they keep mutating. So there's this way in which there's this transmission of story, and then the stories mutate and the stories mutate. So I think there's something just in that that's interesting. But I don't know, they say we're in a Ted Lasso world now. So that we've crossed into a sweeter, kinder story world. I don't know.
Anybody else want to?
I know I just would say the same thing, that people, the reason for the insurrections against the police, the reason for the widespread strikes, because people realize they can. Everything has changed. And so it's changed because knowing that everything can change means I can change everything.
Mm-hmm. And people have lost so much too, that I think there's also a sense that there's if you've already lost a lot, if you've already seen so many people suffer and lose a lot, then perhaps best not to waste any more time and strike while the iron is hot, unintended.
This conversation is becoming more and more intense and interesting. I fear that we have to stop, however. I just wanted to say that what Nisi and Veronica and Joellyn were saying here at the end is really germane to thinking about not just wonder tales, but the fantastic more generally as a mode of storytelling and thinking and experiencing the world that helps us to move out of whatever box we unknowingly are in or unconsciously are in and operate in all the time. So there's escape and there's escape. These narratives have been called escapists as a way to, shoo them away and say they're not very meaningful, but we're escaping reality as it's supposed to be. And just imagining that helps us do that then in reality in some ways. I don't know how, I think the question about the pandemic is something that we'll have to see how that evolves. Fortunately, we have 3 very creative people right here. 4 actually, with Jennifer, who's also a writer, not just a scholar. I'm just like who will maybe take up this challenge. Thank you very much, everyone, for participating, for coming to this, and for celebrating wonder. And thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank
Great
you.
to see everyone.
Thank you very much. You'll have to come back next year after you've put together the next book, the sequel, and to put us in more boxes even. This was a fascinating conversation, and it happens over and over in this festival. We come to the end of our allotted hour, and then we have to figure out how to do a second event to follow up. But anyway, thank you very much. I really appreciate what you put together, and much enjoyed listening to you. Attendees, you can catch this next week sometime on the Better Tomorrow Speaker Series in the YouTube channel. And as I mentioned earlier, it'll be put together, it'll be edited into a highlight video that will be available on our website. Aloha, and thank you.
Aloha, everyone.